Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 339. This week the questions are taken from guide 412 on the Type XXIII U-boats and the accompanying Wednesday video on the Walter and Electro boats, the U-boats of the future, today, kind of. Anyway, let's get on with questions. Unersprechliche Benutzeramen, I think, Benutzermen, maybe, asks, after the siege of Cartagena in 1741, which went less than optimally for the British, the Royal Navy had to burn 5 of its warships because they no longer had the crew to staff them. Sources seem to suggest this was mostly because of diseases ravaging the crews rather than direct combat casualties. This got me wondering, what degree of casualties to disease should have been expected to occur for the Royal Navy during operations in the Caribbean during the 18th century? And how often did fleets have to abandon and burn major warships due to casualties during the Age of Sail? Having to burn your ships due to casualties was a relatively rare event in the Age of Sail. It wasn't unheard of, though. The main reason why it was relatively uncommon was simply because warships had very large crews, but an awful lot of that, obviously, was crews for the guns. And whilst gunners are not necessarily the best people to man your sails and rigging, the casualties to disease would usually be spread out amongst the crew, and particularly amongst those who had to spend a lot of time in confined environments like the gunners. So between that and, of course, in the interests of self-preservation, everybody pitching in and learning from whichever surviving topmen were still around, then you could actually run a warship, if you were just planning to sail it home, on a very, very minimal crew compared to its total notional complement. I mean, you look at some of the big East Indiamen, even with the fact they're fairly heavily armed for merchantmen, compare their crew size to the crew size of a ship of the line of roughly equivalent displacement and dimensions, and you realize that a huge part of a warship's crew at that time period are not actually necessarily all that concerned with the sailing element of it. The flip side to that, of course, is that if you do end up with some kind of disease, whether it be malaria, yellow fever, or even just scurvy, that is capable of taking out 70 or 80% of your crew, it's probably capable of also taking out most of the rest of the 20 or 30% that are left. And if you have a large formation, or even a small formation, you could end up in a situation where certain ships just do not have the crew to be safely sailed anymore, and you need to consolidate crew to give other ships a better chance. So, for example, on Admiral Anson's voyage around the world, some ships are lost, some ships turn back, but when he's about halfway across the Pacific, he ends up having to abandon and burn some of his ships just to make sure that the Centurion has enough men that are fit in order to keep going. And that's another thing you have to take into account when you're looking at the pre-issuing of lime juice era. Just because you have, let's say, 30% of your crew left now, factoring in for scurvy, if you're a long way away from home, you might not have even 15% of your crew left by the time you get to somewhere where you could potentially find more men to sail the ship or just get home. And so you might need to beef the numbers up for that reason. In terms of specifically Royal Navy operations in the Caribbean during the 18th century, there's not really a fixed degree of amount of casualties because it would depend on quite a number of factors, particularly what season you were there in. Certain seasons were known for the spread of disease considerably more than other seasons. And you also have to factor in what kind of operations are you undertaking during your time in the Caribbean. If you're undertaking a lot of operations fairly close to the coastline, such as with the Siege of Cartagena, a lot of sort of idling about and or assaulting shore positions, then you're in much closer proximity to all those wonderful biting insects and stuff that tend to spread a lot of tropical diseases. And back in an era before modern medicine, if something relatively infectious like well, any number of tropical diseases that tend to be caught in that area, got aboard your ship, it would spread very, very quickly because you're talking about very confined areas and no real ability to treat people. But if you happen to be a particularly lucky ship and you didn't get a patient zero, or you were operating in the Caribbean in perhaps an environment where you weren't actually that close to shore all that much, so perhaps you were in the area to hunt a Spanish treasure convoy, or you had been perhaps sailing from Spain to defend said Spanish treasure convoy, then it was much less likely that you were going to end up with a huge outbreak of disease on board. And some islands were known as being hotbeds of disease, other islands less so. And there was also just a time factor. Obviously, the longer the time you spend in the area, especially as I said off the coastline, the higher the chances that someone's going to catch something and start off a whole epidemic aboard your ship. So unfortunately, there was no real kind of, oh, we're sending people to the Caribbean, we can expect to lose X percentage, because you could send a ship to the Caribbean or a fleet, and they could come back with minimal or even fewer than expected, fewer than the average number of losses to disease and so forth. And you could send exactly the same ships back there the next year on a very slightly different mission profile with a slightly different roll of the dice, and barely 20% of everybody you sent out might come back. Nurglezone asks, did the Allies in World War II know about the German Alberich anti-sonar-coating, and how effective was it? The Allies did know about the German Alberich coating, but they only worked out what it was actually for in stages. This is because, contrary to some documentaries, and I use that word loosely, the U-480 was not the first, nor was it the only German U-boat to have an Alberich coating, which is essentially the immediate forerunner of the anechoic tiling that is used on modern submarines, using rubber with air pockets inside it to mitigate the effects of sound, both internal sound, which then won't be transmitted to the water to be heard on hydrophones, and damping the effect of active sonar. Now, because the Allies had actually ended up sinking a number of subs that did have this coating on, including the U-470, which was caught on the surface and sunk by aircraft, from interrogation, they knew that a number of German submarines were being coated with these rubber strips, but initially they had no real idea what they were for. There was some theory that perhaps it helped streamline the sub going through the water. Another theory was that it was perhaps some kind of shock absorption measure to help withstand depth charge attacks. But eventually, through working through the possibilities with their own scientists and compiling the reports from various interrogations, they concluded that it had something to do with reducing the detection radius of ASDIC, what we now call sonar. So, having realized this, they weren't entirely sure how exactly they could counter it other than just getting better and more powerful sonar. But in terms of the effectiveness of it, there were a few drawbacks, one of which was that the tiles, much as they do today as well to a certain degree, tended to come loose, and as you can probably see from this is U7 being coated in tiling for testing purposes. These were actually quite large things, so a part of a tile could come loose and the other part still be attached, which would then flap around and actually have a negative impact because it would cause even more noise than if the submarine didn't have it at all. So that was a bit of a problem. Although, according to some German survivor reports, it was found that if you took the sub down to near enough test depth and then brought it back up again without moving forward or back at particularly high speed, the additional pressure that you experienced down there seemed to cause the tiles to stick to the hull with far greater force than they ever would just being applied on the surface, presumably because of the air pockets inside that allowed them to be compressed, even though obviously they're stuck to the external pressure hull, and that maybe made the adhesive more effective. I don't know. The other issue that the Germans ran into was that depending on the thickness of the rubber and the size of the air pocket, not only would the tiles work specifically against certain frequencies of sonar, and not so much against others, but also with the varying depth that the submarine was at, that would also affect its effectiveness, presumably because, again, the pressure of outside would compress the air pockets, and the size and shape of the air pockets have a direct correlation to how effective it is against sonar and exactly what frequencies of sonar it's effective against. And so there appears to be some submarines that were coated with Alberich that was effective when they were running shallow, and others that were coated with another experimental type that was more effective when they were running at depth. But in overall terms, it seems that depending on which figures you use, there was perhaps somewhere between a 15 and 20% reduction in detection radius for a submarine, which might not sound like all that much, to be perfectly fair, but it could take a submarine into attack range, where perhaps otherwise it wouldn't be able to enter attack range without being detected. And of course, considering that your detection radius is there a radius, therefore on the outer edge you're going to be covering a lot larger of an area, even reducing the detection radius by 15 to 20% actually removes a huge amount of detection area from an anti-submarine vessel's portfolio, which gives the U-boat a lot more opportunities. So, for example, if through experience, using somewhat arbitrary figures, but let's say through experience, Allied escort commanders had worked out that if they stationed their escorts at, let's say, 2,000 yards apart, that would form an unbreakable chain of detection. Then, with this, you would have now a channel a couple of 100 yards wide in between the two escorts through which you could pass, where the escorts would think, oh, if there's a U-boat there, we can detect them, but in fact they wouldn't. So that also offers opportunities in terms of bypassing the escorts to hit the merchant ships. Almirante Brown asks, did Germany and Italy have a coherent strategy for deploying their ocean-going and coastal submarines during World War II to make the best use of the attributes of each type? And if not, how would you have deployed them if you were in charge of the respective Axis navies? Well, the answer is sort of yes, but actually really no for the bulk of the war. Mostly because, well, no plan survives first contact with the enemy, for one thing. But for more detail, the Italians, of course, built most of their submarines with a view to either defending their overseas possessions on, say, the east coast of Africa, or conducting a war in the Mediterranean. Now, while some of their submarines could and did conduct a relatively effective combat routine in the Mediterranean itself is not particularly friendly submarine grounds, but the Regia Marina hadn't really thought much in terms of engaging in deep ocean operations in the middle of the Atlantic, because why would they? It's not really something that's in Italy's interest to do, but then when they're dragged into the war, siding, of course, with the Germans, then that means that, well, they do have these larger, long-range submarines that they're expecting to use for rather specific mission parameters, but now they're being thrown into, attacks on places in the Caribbean, trying to operate in the mid-Atlantic against Allied convoys. So they're having to adapt very quickly, and of course the submarines that they had for long-range overseas deployment, defending their colonial possessions like the Perla, suddenly found themselves having to figure out how the heck do you get back to the Mediterranean, which is where all the action is. And of course, they're up against a whole load of new anti-submarine warfare techniques which force even the strategy the Italians had developed for the Mediterranean to adapt pretty quickly. And as far as the Germans are concerned, they have a strategy going into World War II of where they want to have their U-boats. I mean, they don't have as many as they'd like, and the war's come much earlier than Raeder thought it was going to, but, they have a strategy. Unfortunately for the Germans, they're kind of victims of their own success, because their strategy was largely predicated around basing U-boats out of German ports, and maybe some slightly more advanced ports like the Flanders Flotilla was in World War I. And then suddenly they find themselves, oh, we have Norway, and now there's Arctic convoys. That's not a thing we were planning on attacking. And yes, we were planning on going against Allied, particularly British shipping in the Atlantic, but now we have access to the western French ports on the Atlantic rather than having to sail either through the Channel or around the north of the UK. So while the coastal submarine strategy can still pretty much stay in place, the longer distance strategy is now all up in the air because we're able to base ourselves considerably further forward. So there are now new operational areas we didn't think we could access. Plus, of course, as I said, you've got the new anti-submarine technology facing off against sonar and aircraft patrols closer in, so you're going to have to operate further out than perhaps you'd ideally have liked to. Then there's the whole thing about going after the American coast and loading up additional fuel for that. And so, through various circumstances, in large part because of Germany's success and seizure of the Western Atlantic ports in France, they find themselves having to basically completely rewrite the book. And then, of course, as technology develops, there's more air cover, sonar, centimetric radar, etc., they're constantly having to adapt and readapt their strategies, and short-lived flak U-boats being an example of that. So, in both cases, due to unexpected circumstances, while both nations did have a strategy, it wasn't a strategy that really, in large part, other than sail out and sink Allied shipping, survived the first few months of the war, and they had to then massively rewrite and then continually rewrite it going forward. Brendan Buersdorf asks, was there any way, in your opinion as an engineer, to make the water-drive submarines safer? Or is the whole system just dangerous in general and can't be made safer regardless? There are a few things that you can do to improve the safety of a hydrogen peroxide drive system, but they are relatively limited. More to do with things like just quality control to make sure that the internals are absolutely spick and span and there's not a single trace of any dissimilar material or a burr from manufacturing or anything like that. A lot of the problems are actually very similar to issues with using pure oxygen, for example, because at the end of the day, there are plenty of safe ways to store hydrogen peroxide, even the ridiculously, stupidly highly concentrated stuff that you use in a water drive. However, that's if you want to store it. On a submarine of the water type, you don't want to store it only, you also want to use it as a fuel source. And, well, it's an extremely violent reaction that generates a huge amount of energy, which is the entire point, but it is also incredibly difficult to control. And therefore, especially in that era when pretty much everything is going to be manual or close to, there's only so much you can do to make that safe-ish. Accidents, if this kind of submarine had been produced on a large scale, could and would happen. Especially given that these submarines would inevitably come under attack, so even if you made a system that was hypothetically as close to perfect as it's possible to get in terms of fuel safety and so forth, all it's going to take is one depth charge exploding just a fraction too close, or one bullet coming through the pressure hull from a strafing aircraft, or whatever, and then there's a rupture, and then everything's on fire, and then there's screaming, and hopefully very shortly thereafter there's an implosion. I mean, there's a reason that even these days, when various nations that look for non-nuclear propelled submarines are looking at new fuel sources rather than just the old diesel electric, the air-independent propulsion systems that we see being introduced nowadays are pretty much anything other than high-test hydrogen peroxide. And these days we probably could make a vastly safer system with a lot of computerized controls and monitors in order to, potentially detect problems and shut systems down before they happen. One of the single biggest problems with this kind of propulsion system is that, to be perfectly honest, almost any kind of monitoring and control system you can put on it, whether it's manual, semi-automatic, mechanically automatic, or computerized and automatic, if something does go really dramatically wrong, is probably going to end up dissolved burnt, set on fire, melted, or some other horrific fate, along with everything in the immediate vicinity and a control system that's just faced with, we don't have feed from those sensors anymore, and probably not the control equipment either. Can't really do much other than go, you're all about to die, just thought you should know. BK Zhong asks, considering the ineffectiveness of Japanese anti-submarine warfare efforts, did anyone beside Eugene Fluckey think about using submarines to land ground troops on Japanese-held territory? There was actually quite the sideline in landing troops behind enemy lines using submarines in the Pacific element of World War II. The Americans, obviously primarily, did it with some of their older V-boats, the really big ones, for example, in the Aleutians campaign, and Allied submarines in general, not just the Americans, did quite a number of what you would call today special forces operations. So landing small groups of troops, mostly, to be fair, to help train and equip the locals or conduct observation missions, or very occasionally sabotage missions, not so much a full-scale landing to outflank your opponent, because at the end of the day, even the biggest submarines in anybody's service in World War II could at best transport a few dozen troops, and that's about it. And while Japanese anti-submarine warfare efforts might not be all that much to write home about, if you land, let's say if you're optimistic, 60, 70 troops and tell them, hey, good luck, there's 6,000 fanatical lunatic Japanese soldiers on this island who'll quite happily behead you if you dare to surrender, and well, if you're in combat with them, they'll do a lot worse. Yeah, even with 10, 20, 30 submarines on hand, you aren't going to be able to land any significant light infantry force to actually do all that much damage to a Japanese garrison. And it's that kind of sliding scale of, in theory, if you could divert 24 submarines packed to the gunwales with troops and their equipment, you might get a landing force of several hundred, which might sound pretty good, but again, there's still going to be a light infantry, no real heavy weapon support, no vehicle support, etc. And on an island held by Japanese troops where that kind of force might actually make a difference, it's probably going to be a very small island, and actually landing undetected is going to be very difficult. Whereas if you go after some of the slightly larger Pacific islands where you could perhaps land that kind of force and not be detected immediately, and assuming the US Navy or the various other Allied navies can spare you your 24 subs, you're now probably facing off against 10, 15, 20 plus thousand Japanese troops, and all of a sudden those odds don't look so good anymore, do they? So yes, landing troops on Japanese held territory was definitely a thing, but it was for, as I said, what we would today call special forces operations and raids, rather than underwater amphibious landing craft. Warrant Officer Will asks, if the hydrogen peroxide powered submarine models had made it off the production line, would hydrogen peroxide have been more common in Cold War submarines? I think it would depend very much on how successful they were. They would, of course, have been the fastest submarines underwater in mass production of the war, so their underwater performance capabilities would definitely have recommended them to the Allies and, well, after the war, the Soviets as well, for reproduction. However, that would have to be balanced against how many of them randomly exploded or incinerated their crews due to various issues, both with general production of them and if they came under attack, like we mentioned in an earlier question. Because learning of the German efforts, plus some of their own, various Allied powers did experiment with hydrogen peroxide-powered submarines in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, but with very limited success. I mean, one of the Royal Navy's attempts at such was nicknamed an HMS Exploder for a very good reason. And so if the outcome was, we mass-produced a bunch of Type 18s and we suffered 40% losses to its own fuel source for various reasons, then it's highly unlikely that there would have been a particularly common Cold War submarine type running around with hydrogen peroxide engines instead of, say, diesel electric, which is probably what they would have aimed to use to succeed them, because nuclear power is a whole other ballgame. But if, let's say, for sake of argument, the Germans had produced a Type 18A, and that had a bunch of issues, but then perhaps they'd done a Type 18B and a Type 18C, and by the time they got to the Type 18C, the 18C was still capable of very significant underwater performance levels, but had mostly managed not to melt its crew alive. Then I think there would have been a lot more interest in hydrogen peroxide as a power source instead of diesel electric, or perhaps in addition to, because remember, a number of the Walter design boats did have backup diesel generators as well. So it certainly would be a possibility, but I think given the issues historically with the fuel source, you probably would have had to have the Germans at least prove to a certain degree that it was reliable in combat conditions before the Allies would pick it up and run with it. Vespelian asks, how did the Type 21, 23 and Walter type U-boats, etc. compare to the Japanese Type 201? It depends exactly on how you want to rate the various submarines in question, because compared to the Type 21, which would be its closest analogue, although it's somewhat later coming into service, the Type 201 is in theory a better submarine. It's a reasonable bit faster underwater, and of course it has access to the best submarine launched torpedoes of the war in the Type 95s, but the flip side to that is that it only has 4 forward torpedo tubes, as opposed to the 6 on the Type 21. So in terms of an attack submarine that can go out to sea and continuously attack your opponents, the Type 21 can be out there for longer and has a bigger forward spread, but the 201 perhaps has a slightly greater chance of actually getting in and delivering an attack in the first place and then escaping. And broadly as an underwater hull form, I would say the 201 is a slightly better design. But then when you look at it, you realise that dimensionally it's actually a fraction longer than a Type 21, but as we said, carries slightly less armament and is overall smaller despite the greater length. When you look at its displacement, it displaces considerably less than a Type 21. But that's because it is even more optimised for underwater travel than a Type 21 is, because bear in mind the Type 21 is an adaptation of the Type 18, so it's a compromise already, and the Type 18 is a compromise on what you would otherwise want fully for an underwater hull profile, the same as the Type 23, in favour of making it theoretically slightly easier to produce via that mass production modular method, whereas the I-201, built much more along traditional submarine lines, all in one place at one time, is able to optimise a little bit better in that regard. So essentially it's kind of, well, what element of being a submarine do you value the most? If you value pure performance and hydrodynamics, you want the 201. If you value mass production and a slightly heavier punch in terms of number of torpedoes, if not necessarily hitting power per torpedo, then the Type 21 is your go-to. The Type 23 is a bit of an unfair comparison because it's even more heavily optimized towards mass production rather than optimal underwater profile, and it's also a small coastal type, whereas the 201 is a deep ocean type like the 21. The Walter boats obviously never got produced, so we won't know exactly whether or not they would have lived up to their expectations, but we can draw certain inferences from the 21, which is an adapted Type 18 hull, and of course with the Walter propulsion they would have been faster still than a 201, but strictly speaking, if you stuck a Walter drive system in a Type 201, it should in theory go even faster than a Type 18. But broadly speaking, this really shouldn't come as too much of a surprise, considering that the Japanese have the entire interwar period as a continuous and open line of development for their submarine forces, whereas the Germans are working off of what they could secretly produce on a small scale in the Netherlands for most of the interwar period, and then having to do a crash catch-up in the 30s. New Reality asks, was there ever any thoughts in World War II of giving submarines a vertically firing torpedo or a floating mine, one that they could fire while submerged, and thus it could attack a ship on the surface, maybe perhaps even with a clever hydrophone setup that you could try and use to aim such a device, a bit like a Jägerfaust on the ME-163? Not really, for a couple of good reasons. Firstly, if you were in a position where you were directly beneath an enemy vessel, you had much, much bigger problems than, oh, can we fire a weapon at them? Like the fact that you were probably about to get deluged with depth charges. Another problem is if you look at the hull diameter of contemporary submarines and then look at the length of a torpedo, let alone the length of the tube that you need to fit it in, then at best this would be a one-shot weapon because there's no way you're reloading it. But more realistically, you're probably not even going to get that because it probably isn't going to fit unless you start doing weird angling things. And at that point, you may as well just fire a torpedo out of your conventional tubes because torpedoes could and would go up to a specific depth if you fired them below a certain depth. The problem with a mine is that even a really buoyant mine would take time to get to the surface. And that means that if you were going to release some kind of extremely buoyant anti-shipping mine into the path or into an attacking ship, you would have to be dead ahead of that ship, knowing exactly what the speed and course of the pursuing ship was, and you would need to be some distance ahead of that vessel and hope that they, didn't hear the launch and change course or something like that. And if you're again in that position, then well, you don't want to be in that position because you're going to be slower than your opponent in the early and mid part of the war, which means, you're about to get run over and have depth charges dropped on you. And in the late part of the war, even if you were in a fast boat like a Type 21 or a Type 23, you were probably still about to get hit by hedgehogs. So again, not a situation where you want to be worrying about launching some finicky vertical launch weapon system that may or may not work. That's the time you want to be putting maximum effort into getting out of there. And if you're not at essentially what counts in submarine warfare as point-blank range, then certainly by the time anyone could have developed or tested this kind of system, if you're a German ship at least, just fire an acoustic homing torpedo. It'll do all that you could possibly want it to do out of a system like that, plus it'll track in on your opponent, which is quite helpful. Jet Driver asks, for those of us who are used to thinking of hydrogen peroxide as a benign disinfectant stored in plastic bottles, could you elaborate on the challenges of using and storing it in the water boats? Essentially, almost all the challenges are to do with the concentration levels. Similarly to how there's a certain percentage of oxygen in the atmosphere, and air, generally speaking, is not all that difficult to store. It just kind of sits there around us, not doing all that much, apart from, being breathable, hopefully. But if you are suddenly faced with pure oxygen, like Japanese torpedo propulsion systems were, for example, suddenly it becomes a whole lot more dangerous. And similarly with hydrogen peroxide, the kind of stuff that you can buy over the counter is going to be 3-4%, maybe 5% at most. And that, even then, is pretty dangerous. You absolutely do not want to get it in your eyes. You obviously don't want to ingest it unless you like being poisoned and or popping like a balloon, or at least your internals. And you probably don't want to get it on your skin either. But if you keep it in an opaque bottle on a shelf in a cool environment, it's probably not going to do anybody any real damage, except for the things you actually want to damage, like mold and bacteria. I do love one of the instruction manuals for using an anti-mold solution of hydrogen peroxide, which that particular one is 3.5% solution, but it's an industrial cleaner, so it just comes in a generic white plastic bottle, and it has instructions that basically say, like, if you're dealing with some really, really serious mold, then you can get this higher concentration, which it says will be more effective. And I looked up the serial code for the higher concentration that you can get, and you can only really get it if you're a business and can prove it, at least in the UK. And that stuff's 30%. And I'm sitting there going, yeah, no kidding. 30% hydrogen peroxide. That's going to be a lot stronger and a lot more effective at murdering every organic bit of material in the room, including perhaps the mold you want to kill. That really is a nuclear option. But, of course, the hydrogen peroxide that they're using on the water boats is 80 to 90% proof, and you probably saw some of the reactions in the comments of the video when I mentioned that kind of figure. That's the kind of figure where anyone with a decent knowledge of chemistry, to quote one particularly good book, has a good pair of running shoes nearby, because both the reaction, or reactivity, I should say, of hydrogen peroxide and the violence with which it reacts increases directly proportional to concentration levels, perhaps unsurprisingly, which in turn means that, sure, you could store 3-5% hydrogen peroxide in a plastic bottle at home, because the minor incidental things it may or may not come into contact with are probably not going to be a major problem. If you store 80 to 90% hydrogen peroxide, assuming it doesn't find some trace element of something organic on the inside of the bottle and either therefore eat its way out or blow its way out, the vapors that are going to come off the minute that you uncover it will, if you're lucky, kill you very quickly. If you're unlucky, potentially set you on fire or start melting you if you're a bit too close to them. And will just generally react both with great alacrity and extreme violence with pretty much anything it can come into contact with. And as with most reactions, the greater the surface area you can offer it, the more violent that reaction is going to be. So essentially, if you're going to store hydrogen peroxide on a submarine for use as a fuel source, then whatever you're storing it in has to be absolutely, completely and utterly inert as far as its reactivity is concerned, and that's a relatively small group of things that it won't react with, and you have to make absolutely sure that every part of your system is properly sealed, and that what you're using, especially once it gets to the reaction end of the system, is extremely resistant to temperature, because a violent decomposition of high-strength hydrogen peroxide generates a huge amount of heat, which is obviously good for a propulsion system. Not so good if you have your basically explosive reaction going on and then the chamber you're using to contain it melts. That's not going to end well for anybody. So there's quite a lot of parallels to actually storing 100% pure oxygen. Essentially, if you're dealing with 80 to 90% pure hydrogen peroxide, one, I pity you, get another job. And two, if you can't do that, then if something goes wrong with that kind of system, your absolute best bet is to be as close as possible to the point of failure, because then at least your death might be quick. H. Sean Iraqi asks, why didn't the US ever consider using the 15-inch or 381mm caliber gun on their battleships? Jumping from 14 to 16-inch seems a little bit strange. Was this linked to the Japanese going with the same formula on their warships? Also, what inspired the development and then later cancellation of the US's own 18-inch guns? As far as the 18-inch gun went, the US developed it mostly because everybody else was developing bigger guns, and bigger guns seemed to be the best way of following naval design trends. However, the reason that they developed and then actually cancelled and then looked into and cancelled again the idea of using an 18-inch gun came down to trade-offs. The US looked at the situation and they reckoned, at least in their opinion, that at reasonable battle ranges, both in the early 1920s and then in the late 30s and early 40s, a 16-inch gun and an 18-inch gun would both probably reliably penetrate the most likely armour that they were going to come across. If they'd heard about what the British were planning for the N3s, they might have been a bit more enthusiastic about an 18-inch gun, but nonetheless. So reckoning that both types would be able to penetrate armour, they then realised that, well, an 18-inch gun has two major downsides at that stage, one of which is it's pushing the edges of what technology will allow you to do in terms of loading heavy guns in a battleship, at that time without some considerable new invention, which is going to limit your rate of fire, which didn't sound so good, because obviously if you had 16-inch guns, therefore you could fire a little bit faster, therefore you have more shells going down range, therefore you're more likely to score hits. And similarly, thanks to the square cube law, 18-inch guns and their shells would be hugely heavy, which would mean that if, so let's say, for example, you're looking at a South Dakota 1920s design, yeah, you could have 8 guns, in 4 twin turrets, or you could have 12 guns if you use the 16-inch caliber in 4 triples, and that gave you half again as many guns, which of course is half again as many chances to hit. So combine that with a higher rate of fire, and you perhaps would have, they reckon, a 1.8, possibly even a twice as high chance to hit your opponent with a large battery of 16-inch guns as you would with a small battery of 18-inch, and then, well, if both will penetrate, then there is no real justification for the 18-inch. As far as the US not using the 15-inch caliber, well, there's 2 ways of looking at it, and they're both kind of halves of the overall correct view. Firstly, there was the case of the US assessing, as with most battleships, what are the likely targets, how are they armoured, what penetration do we need to get through that armour, therefore that will to a certain degree dictate at least the minimum calibre of gun that we're going to use. And given that in the First World War period, US ships were actually quite heavily emphasising protection over speed and firepower, that would lend themselves naturally to having a slightly heavier calibre of gun. But also, once you've made the shift to 14-inch from 12-inch, going up to 15-inch doesn't make too much logical sense on the basis that you're not going to get a huge increase in broadside firepower, but you will have a significant decrease in number of guns that you can wield. Now, that's because there was a general rule of thumb which, as well as looking at things like range and armor penetration, was also just looking at sheer weight of shell that you were throwing at your opponent. And thanks to the square cube law, the weight of shells as they get larger goes up very, very, very dramatically. So, for example, a 12-inch shell, as used by, let's say, the British and the American navies, weighs 860 to 870 pounds. So you'd think, okay, well, therefore a 24-inch shell would weigh about 1,600. Well, no. Because of the square cube law, actually both 15 and 16 shells weigh well above 1,600 pounds. But, of course, the same thing applies for the guns and so forth. So what the navies generally were looking at was, if we're going to increase the weight of our armament and therefore decrease the number of barrels, so similar to what we were saying earlier about the hitting potential if you have more guns versus fewer, so if we're going to accept we're going to have fewer guns aboard, are we throwing as much if not more shell weight at the enemy as possible? Essentially your broadside weight. It's a crude but relatively effective measure. So using, for example, British 12-inch guns, a 12-gun broadside from a British 12-inch gun ship would have a broadside weight of just over 10,000 pounds. When they go up to the 13.5-inch gun, which is in part helped by the fact they're looking at triple a 12-inch, and it turns out that twin 13.5-inch actually in turret form weighs almost exactly the same as a triple 12, that offers you, with just 10 13.5-inch guns, about 12,500 pounds of shells going down range, which is about a 22.5% increase in throw weight, despite the fact you've lost 2 guns. So that's good. And then you step up again to 15 inches for the British, and the throw weight has gone up to about 15,300 pounds, which is about a 21.5% increase over the 13.5-inch broadside, even though you're now only using 8 guns. So you're looking at around, on average, let's say a 22% increase in throw weight per broadside by stepping up in 1.5-inch increments, even though each time you're losing 2 guns, from the British perspective. Now switch over to the Americans. They have 12-gun dreadnoughts that have 12-inch guns, and their throw weight is about 10,500 pounds for the broadside. They step it up to 14-inch guns, so 10 guns. So you're losing 2, which is Texas, New York, Nevada, and Oklahoma. And your broadside is now £14,000. So that's about a 34% increase. So excellent. The problem then is if you went up to 15-inch guns, you would have to lose some guns because the 15-inch gun weighs more than a 14-inch gun. But if you go to, let's say, 8 15-inch guns, which would be a logical step down in numbers from 10 14-inch guns, you're only getting a 9 to 10% increase in broadside throw weight, which isn't all that much compared to losing 2 guns worth of chances to hit. Whereas if you step up to 16-inch guns, and using the Colorado's early shell weights as an example there, that gives you just under 18,000 pounds of broadside weight for 8 guns, which is about a 28% increase in broadside throw weight over 10 14-inch guns. Although interestingly, it's only a 6 to 7% increase in throw weight over a dozen 14-inch guns, which is what you have on the Pennsylvanias, New Mexicos, and Tennessees, which kind of indicates at that point the US thinking is perhaps more centered around total armor penetration capability, but also shows why you wouldn't go for, let's say, 8 or 10 15-inch guns, because at that point you might actually be sacrificing shell throw weight. A.B. Coates asks, did large corporations in the Age of Sail like the British and Dutch East India Companies have their own navies, and how large-effective were they? And was there much overlap in crews between state and private navies? For example, would a Royal Navy officer on half pay find himself in command of an East India Company ship? Yes, both the British and Dutch East India Companies did have their own navies, although for their respective heydays, the British East India Company had a little bit more of a distinct navy. And that's because although both East India Companies have roughly the same origin point in the early 1600s, the Dutch East India Company's heyday came first. And although in the 1600s there was a gradually growing division, which obviously it started in the 1500s and was accelerating, between warship and merchant ship, the two types were still a lot closer than they would be in, say, the 1800s. And Dutch ships in particular very often very much straddled the line between, is this a slightly inefficient warship or an incredibly heavily armed merchant ship? So although there were a few dedicated warships within the Dutch East India Company, most of their effective firepower would come from just going, hey, look, we happen to have a bunch of suspiciously heavily armed and reasonably agile merchantmen. I guess if you displease us enough, we're just going to turn around and suddenly become a fleet of war. Whereas with the British East India Company, with their heyday coming in the 1700s and to a certain extent even the early 1800s, their ships, although still at the larger scale very heavily armed because of the value of their cargoes for a merchant ship, were markedly weaker than a similar sized capital ship. So occasionally some of the really big East Indiamen would be taken into Royal Navy service, but when that was done, if you looked at their dimensions, you would think, oh, that's like a third rate at least, as in a 74 gunner at the upper end of third rates. But then when they're actually brought into service, it's found that even fully dedicated to war, there may be 52 gunner, that kind of region. And obviously in regular service, that ship might have only had a couple of dozen guns, and often smaller and lighter guns than you'd expect for a ship of that size. But as a result, they did also have some dedicated warships, a lot of dedicated gunboats and the like for coastal and river work, and a few full dedicated warships, frigate size, even occasionally up to a very small ship of the line size. Of course, the Nemesis was an East India Company ship pretty much entirely designed for war. In terms of effectiveness, I mean, they're not going to get quite the same level of drill and quite the same level of support as an actual dedicated navy, even the fully dedicated combat ships, nor are they going to get the same amount of training. But they could, just through practice, especially if you were based out in either the Dutch East Indies, the Spice Islands, or the India, you could get a fair bit of experience. So you might find an East India Company vessel, whether it be British or Dutch, might actually be very experienced and effective in operating off the coast and in the rivers of the area that they are in, but would be at something of a disadvantage in an open sea fight against, say, a Spanish or French frigate. And yes, there absolutely was crossover where half-pay captains in the Royal British or Royal Dutch navies would find themselves commanding East India Company ships of their respective nations. And there's even a relatively famous incident where a squadron of British frigates was escorting a bunch of East Indiamen, some fairly large ones, and a French squadron showed up that was significantly more powerful than the escort was. But the escort's commander had a brilliant idea, and through cunning use of paint and desperately praying to every deity he thought might help that the East India Company captains would actually stay in something resembling a line of battle, he managed at a distance to persuade the French that what they were seeing was actually 4 or 5 ships of the line with a frigate escort, and that, if it was true, was considerably stronger than the French squadron strength, and so the French backed off. And this is why I occasionally remark, if you think corporations have power today, you ain't seen anything. Because, 17th, 18th, early 19th century East India companies, whether they be Dutch or British, but especially the British towards the end, when you've got a mega corporation that pretty much on its own has taken over a good chunk of a subcontinent, has an army that is at times numerically actually larger than the actual army of the country it's ostensibly based from, and has its own combat ships, that's when you can worry about a mega corporation that can seriously threaten the integrity of a nation, as opposed to, oh no, they might pay some politicians. Because of course the East Indian Company did that as well. Think more Trade Federation from Star Wars. Fool in a Hat asks, I recently visited the Kviberg Cemetery in Gothenburg and the British war graves there. Among them I found several graves for the crew of HM Drifter Catspaw, who died when the ship sank at the end of 1919. Question, what is a drifter in military service other than a small ship or boat, and would it be possible to get a 5-second history of Catspaw, what she did and what happened to her? So the short version is that fishing boats at the time, at least ocean-going ones or sea-going ones, were normally split between trawlers and drifters. A trawler trawled with a net, and a drifter didn't drift, it used a drift net, which is basically like a giant curtain made of netting hung in the ocean. But because it didn't have to actively haul the net around to catch things the way that a trawler did, the average drifter was smaller and slower than a trawler. This, of course, meant it was also very cheap compared to a trawler if you wanted to build mass numbers of ships. And the other attraction for the Admiralty, certainly in World War I, which is when Catspaw was built, was that if you built a huge number of drifters and trawlers, you could get use out of them in the war, and then you could sell them on to private industry and get some money back after the war. And drifters were seen as a nice cheap way of doing all sorts of ancillary tasks. Minesweeping was one of them. Small, slow speed, shallow draft, pretty good at that. Available in large numbers. Tending to anti-submarine nets, because, well, a drift net is a big curtain of, at that point, usually hemp hung in the water, and a anti-submarine net was a big curtain of usually steel hung in the water. So managing them, maintaining them, repairing them, checking on them, and opening and closing them for ships coming in and out, this was the perfect kind of job for drifters. And obviously with lots of anti-submarine nets around, etc., very useful in those roles. Could also be used in an anti-submarine role. Not the best idea, but in a pinch. Occasionally also seen on blockade duty. Usually had a single gun. You can see on this example there's the gun up front. In the case of Catspaw, she was actually built right at the end of World War I, launched in August 1918, with a maximum displacement of just under 200 tons soaking wet and fully loaded, and a stately speed of 9 knots and 1 6-pounder gun. However, she was not involved in the First World War when she met her end. She'd actually gone up into the Baltic to be part of the squadron that was led by Admiral Cowan, which included one Captain Cunningham, in the attempt by the Royal Navy to intervene on behalf of the White Russians against the Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolutionary Wars. But towards the end of 1919, when everything was beginning to freeze up, she was heading home, because a drifter is many things, but able to handle northern Baltic ice it's not. And then there was heavy weather, and she basically vanished. It's still not entirely clear what happened to her. The only real clue came that when they found the wreck, they found apparently that the engine was somewhat separated from the wreck, so the Admiralty thought maybe something had gone wrong with the engine, which had obviously then left her at the mercy of the weather. But that, I think, from what I've been able to tell, is about all they've been able to figure out as to the cause of her loss. Oh, and incidentally, the Admiralty manufactured two main types of drifter in the First World War. One was wood-hulled, one was steel, and Catspaw was one of the steel-hulled examples. The almighty Hypnotoad asks, how strong was the Dutch East India Company in comparison to other navies at the height of its power, and in the event of war with another colonial power, could the Dutch government press the company into actual naval service in its area of interest? It's a little bit of an elastic one, because the Dutch East India Company as a whole was vastly more powerful than a lot of the, well, you can't really use the term third world because it doesn't really apply, a lot of the non-European nations that it showed up to try and trade with. But at the same time, a Dutch East India Company fleet was still, at the end of the day, obviously referring also back to the earlier question, it was still a merchant fleet that was somewhat heavily armed. If it came across an actual war fleet, it would be in trouble. Now, much as the British East India Company occasionally had some of its larger ships pressed into service, the Dutch could press some Dutch East India Company ships into service in time of war, but in both cases, and obviously in this case specifically with the Dutch, and in fact perhaps more so with the Dutch even than the British, it wouldn't necessarily be a good idea to do so outside of one or two or maybe a handful of really big ships that might make very useful mid to large scale warships, simply because the Netherlands isn't that big, and in and of itself, certainly at the time that we're talking about, doesn't really produce a huge amount economically in order to fund a war. So if you are at war, and you are the Dutch, you absolutely need the large revenues of the Dutch East India Company to help fund that war. And if you pressed all of their ships into service so they could, as warships, so they couldn't trade, then you have an even bigger bill to maintain those ships and no money coming in, essentially, to fund them, which means the war's going to be over very soon because you're going to be bankrupt. But in terms of more local area conflicts, could the Dutch Navy, the proper Dutch Navy that is, show up and go, oi, you lot, Dutch East India ships, you're going to help us out with this, that, or the other, then yeah, that could definitely happen, and sometimes did, in large part because if you were having a more local conflict, whether that be with a nearby nation in one of the Spice Islands or India or something, or with Portuguese, British, etc., trade vessels in potentially small elements of their navies as well, well, it would also be in the Dutch East India Company's best interests to fight alongside the formal Dutch warships, because A, it would potentially get them more profit centres, and B, if they didn't fight and they left the Dutch fleet on its own and the Dutch fleet lost, well, guess who the Portuguese or British or whoever ships would be coming after next? The Rogue Chief asks, Bearn sucked as a carrier. Okay, fine. What was the best alternative for France? Could they have converted a cruiser or an ocean liner? Or what about a German ship as a reparation? For example, could the Imperator-class Bismarck have seen new life as a French carrier? Her specifically, since she hadn't been completed by the time of the Versailles Treaty. The US probably wouldn't have given up Vaterland-Leviathan, and you don't likely want Imperator for the job. You're absolutely right in that the French really don't have any hulls available to them that would make a suitable aircraft carrier. Anything smaller than Bearn is, well, smaller and even less capable in terms of aircraft carriage, even if perhaps a cruiser hull might be faster. But I don't think the liners of the various German liner companies would be strategically wise to ask for, because a lot of other ocean liner operating companies and nations kind of wanted the German liners to basically restock in exchange for the liners that they'd lost to German U-boats. So there'd be some pretty stiff competition for them in the war prize allocation department. However, I do think there is one thing they could have gone for that would have made a much better candidate, and that would be a Mackensen-class battle cruiser. The Germans did have a few of them around. None of them were complete. They had a couple of the holes in the water, but as you can see, this is Prince Eitel Friedrich. She isn't in anywhere close to a completed state. And there's the hull of Württemberg alongside, just in case you're wondering. Now, of course, that means that the Mackensen hulls are in roughly the same condition as Bearn's hull was in terms of state of completion, but they're longer, far larger, and a lot faster. So I think if the Marine Nationale had slightly changed up what it was demanding in terms of war reparations and gone, look, okay, we won't take one or two of the German active cruisers, we'll take the hull of a Mackensen and all the engine spare parts from the other Mackensens that are around, and we're going to make ourselves a carrier out of it. That, I think, would have gone a lot better for them, because a lot of the materials from the other Normandies that were around, well, some of them were used to help complete Bearn, but a lot of the other materials were either sold, obviously, for money, or used to help modernize other elements of the Marine Nationale. So although Bearn was, substantially on her way to being built, I think grabbing a Mackensen hull and, as I said, all the extra spare parts and stuff from the other Mackensen hulls that was around, and then selling off Bearn along with what was left of her sisters for profit and modernization of the rest of the fleet, would have done them a lot better, because they would have gotten I think a pretty decent carrier for the interwar period out of a Mackensen hull. Patrick Donnelly asks, if the US Navy decided against reassigning Enterprise CV-6 as a night carrier at the end of 1944, could she keep up with the air group sizes and sortie rates being demanded by Task Force 38-58, especially as she'd be loaded with 4 squadrons much larger than what she originally carried? I think she could have done on 2 grounds. Firstly, the carrier task groups that were operating on the front line in 1945 were made up of a mix of Essex class and Independence class. Now, while a Yorktown class has about 10,000 square foot less hangar space than an Essex class, it has considerably more hangar space and general capacity than an Independence class. So, my first point of logic would be, if an Independence class can be thought of as a frontline carrier in various carrier task groups in 1945, then Enterprise can easily as well, even if she's not technically quite as capable as an Essex class. The other thing is that prior to going full night carrier, Enterprise's last, if you like, mostly daytime air group was Carrier Air Group 20. Of course, Carrier Air Group 90, the night fighting one, still could operate during the day as well, but that's neither here nor there. My point is, Carrier Air Group 20 actually went from Enterprise in the late part of 1944 over to the Lexington, the Essex class Lexington, the one that's now at Corpus Christi. And interestingly enough, they actually lost a squadron in doing so, because when they were operating on Enterprise, they of course had a fighter squadron, a dive bomber squadron, and a torpedo bomber squadron. But when they were operating on Lexington, they had those, but Enterprise also had a small night fighter unit aboard. So there was actually a 4th unit, albeit obviously not the same size as VF-20, that was on Enterprise but wasn't on Lexington. Now, of course, they probably added a few more aircraft to VF, VB, and VT-20 or Lexington, but it does indicate that they weren't necessarily operating 4 squadron carrier air groups off of every Essex class. And then also, as we saw quite a while back, to be honest, but when I did a video showing the evolution of the Japanese and American carrier air groups, you see that towards the end of the war, a lot of American carrier air groups were actually quite heavy on the fighters. And of course, fighters, especially with folding wings, take up considerably less space. So I would argue on these grounds, as well as the previous ones, that yeah, Enterprise could have kept up. She wouldn't have operated a 4-squadron formation unless she kept the small night fighting unit aboard. But with a 3-squadron formation, as established with Lexington in 1945, that's a perfectly operational frontline carrier air group. And with Enterprise, I would have just maybe slightly edged the number of fighters, the number of F6Fs up, and she was still operating a reasonable number of SB2Cs, or SBC2s, or whatever the hell diver was, and Avengers. But if you kept those as kind of standard-ish and really pushed on the F6Fs, you could probably get a roughly similar size air group in sheer number of airframes as you would with an Essex, just a little bit more fighter-heavy, which, given that Enterprise would have been unique, along with Saratoga, last surviving members of their class, might actually put her in a really good position as well, because she could contribute a decent amount to strikes, but she could also be a kind of fighter carrier for combat air patrol. Maximus Tillman IV asks, USS Langley had a house for carrier pigeons on the stern between the 5-inch guns. When did the use of pigeons start, and were they used for ship-to-shore only, or could they be used for ship-to-ship? The use of carrier pigeons on aircraft carriers was, I think, fortunately for all concerned, a relatively short-lived initiative, essentially coming in the very narrow gap between the implementation of radio and a brief flirtation with, if you like, that lovely microcontrol and also expecting constant reports back that dogged various navies at various points in the early 20th century, combined with a fear of detection, either triangulation or decryption, basically the enemy knowing where you were. And of course, carrier pigeons, you can intercept them, but that is a physical thing rather than just sticking an antenna in the air. But the whole thing was discontinued pretty quickly because it turned out, one, on the scale of oceanic warfare, pigeons couldn't travel all that far, so unless you were planning on using your carriers as essentially floating airfields for coastal defense, it wasn't really practical. Second, carrier pigeons work really well when they know where they're going from and they know where they're going to. Now, from a moving start point, they can do relatively well, but less well. And of course, they're out at sea, so they have very little in the way of rest points, especially if you're quite far out at sea. And no, you can't really use them for ship to ship because, unfortunately, they have just enough stamina to fly off in all sorts of interesting directions and then find they have nowhere to land. Whereas you'd think perhaps they might land on another ship purely from, I'm tired, either here is the only place to land, I'll drop off here. But of course, there'd be multiple ships in the fleet. And as I said, those ships would usually be a bit closer than where they'd finally hit their fatigue point. And of course, they have no idea where the other ship is. So it would be complete luck of the draw if a carrier pigeon went from one ship to another and it was actually the one you wanted them to go to. And finally, Glenn Ricafrente asks, the passing of naval supremacy from the Royal to the US Navy was fairly amicable. Was there ever another time in history that this happened when the ascending naval power did not have to execute a hostile takeover? Very technically, yes, but in the kind of manner you're speaking when both fleets had substantial strength, no. So what I mean by technically is that there were cases, at least in the, roughly speaking, Western maritime and naval history sphere, where somebody rose into prominence and became kind of the dominant naval power, and their rise to that final bit of supremacy in and of itself didn't occur with much, if anything, of a fight, but that was usually because there wasn't a dominant naval power at the time to take over from. And now that could be either in something like the medieval period when navies on a large scale basically existed when there was a war on and they got called up. So, for example, if there'd been a relatively long period of peace, and I say relatively because we are talking the medieval times, someone was always bashing someone else over the head with a poleaxe. But if there had been maybe a few decades of peace in a certain area, and then suddenly, I don't know, the French decided they were going to go to war, and they raised a massive fleet, well, they would now become the dominant naval power. They would have naval supremacy because everybody else essentially didn't have a fleet outside of private royal collections. But that was just because, as I said, there wasn't one. Or the old slight variant on that, which would be that there had been a dominant naval power, and they had fought somebody, right down to the wire, and they and the person they fought were completely exhausted, and then somebody else stepped in and went, hey, I'm in charge now, which technically is peaceful-ish in terms of the person who's actually taking over, but in the wider scope of things was not a changeover that happened in peaceful conditions. So if you look at the various Greek city-states going back to ancient history, a few times a city-state would rise to being a prominent naval power just by building a bunch of ships, and another city-state might previously have been the dominant naval power, but they'd beaten themselves raw fighting a third city-state, and therefore they either couldn't afford or no longer had a navy, and this other one just went, oh, well, I guess we're in charge of the seas now. And you could even look in some respects in the mid to late 1600s, early 1700s, various powers at that point could technically claim to be supreme at sea, but it shifted quite a bit because you had a mixture of the English, the Dutch, the French, and the Spanish, all in various alliances with each other against the other lot, constantly shifting, and every so often a war would kick off because, randomly taking an example, the English and the Dutch had managed to knock each other into exhaustion, so the French fleet was suddenly the dominant one in Europe, but it would only last a decade or two before the former enemies, the English and the Dutch, went, hang on a minute, we don't like the French being in charge here. Let's both team up to kick them to the curb and then go back to fighting each other. And that brings us to the end of this week's Dry Dock. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, if indeed you still are, and I hope to see you again in another Dry Dock soon, or another video of any description, really.